My plate is empty, my mother said, sliding it toward me with a smile too thin. Get the water, she added, voice sharp enough for every cousin to hear. I'll clear the dishes after dessert, my aunt muttered, avoiding my eyes. Your help, not family, my mother finished, still looking at the turkey, not me. I sat very still, my fingers holding the chair's cool wooden edge, and promised myself this before the night ended: the power of attorney naming me would speak. The mantel clock ticked once, slow and loud, as if it counted my breath. Stay, let the documents speak first. The table shimmered under the overhead light, a mix of china plates and leftover foil. My father sat at the far end, recovering from surgery, his napkin folded twice. I had arranged the appointments, filled the pillboxes, and paid the small co-pays without a word. Now, with the family gathered, my mother acted as though I were a maid she tolerated for show. Each command landed heavier because it was public and because she held the paper everyone thought mattered. I reached into my bag and touched the thin envelope holding the notarized power of attorney, a document so many people mention but rarely read. Its second page named me as the alternate agent, effective if the first agent acted outside her scope. The envelope felt warm from my palm, like a pulse waiting to move. Across the table, my cousin passed the mashed potatoes and whispered something about boundaries. I kept my eyes on the glass of water I was supposed to fetch. My aunt tried a soft distraction. Let's bless the food again, she said, hands half raised. My mother ignored her. Bring the cranberry sauce, she told me instead. I rose, feeling the carpet's rough seam under my shoes, and walked to the kitchen. The fridge hummed steadily, a low sound that had comforted me as a child. I opened the door, retrieved the sauce, and breathed once. My reflection in the stainless steel looked calmer than I felt. When I returned, my father shifted slightly. Thank you, he said quietly. It was the first time that evening anyone had thanked me. My mother's eyebrow twitched, but she said nothing. I placed the sauce near her plate and sat down again, my hands folded. The envelope pressed against my side, reminding me of its weight. If words failed, the dates and signatures would not. She's just helping, my cousin said softly, as though I were invisible. It's nice she can. My mother smirked. Helping is all she's good for. Heat climbed my neck, but my voice stayed low. I'm here for Dad, I said. That's all. The air vent above us whirred, pushing a faint smell of Lysol from the hallway into the dining room. My stomach steadied under the scent of disinfectant and roasted turkey. Inside, I replayed the attorney's explanation. If the named agent oversteps, the alternate steps in immediately. The clause is clear, he had said, showing me the notary's log number beside the signature. That number matched the stamp still faintly visible on the back page. Tonight, surrounded by family, I was holding a silent witness stronger than any speech. Dessert plates clinked as my aunt cleared a few. My mother gestured at me to take the rest. I stayed seated. The clock ticked again. My father's eyes met mine briefly, a flicker of recognition passing between us. I thought of the upcoming appointment with his cardiologist, already confirmed under my name. Paper remembers even when people forget. My cousin across the table leaned closer. Why don't you ever say anything back, she asked, not unkindly. Because noise never saved anyone, I answered. Documents and small truths usually do. She blinked and glanced at the envelope near my hand. She had seen enough family fights to know what I meant. Another command came. Pour the coffee, my mother said, voice carrying over the chatter. I rose steady this time and went to the kitchen. The coffee percolator burped softly, filling the air with a warm, bitter scent. I poured cups for the guests but left hers for last. My fingers no longer trembled. A quiet question settled in my mind: how many more commands until someone notices the paper's edge? Returning to the table, I served the coffee and Saturday. My father sipped and gave a small nod. My mother reached for the sugar without looking at me. The envelope brushed my palm again. I pictured the signature line, the date, the notary stamp. Each detail was a lifeline, steady and factual, waiting for its moment. The conversation shifted to holiday plans. My aunt mentioned bringing a witness next time for family agreements. Laughter fluttered around the table but did not reach my mother. She tapped her fork twice as if to summon service. I did not move. My shoulders squared, my breath stayed even. Boundaries, I thought, start silent. Across the room, the afternoon sun on the drapes turned gold, then dimmed. Shadows stretched across the floor like lines on a ledger. The clock ticked a third time. My father placed his spoon down gently. We should talk about January appointments, he murmured. My mother waved a hand. I'll handle them. My father shook his head slowly. Maybe not. The room went still. I did not speak, but my hand rested on the envelope. The nurse from the clinic had emailed me earlier confirming Monday's visit under my authority. Proof sat quietly, in my phone, a timestamp and a subject line no one could dispute. Even so, I let the silence build. Public scenes feed on noise, paper feeds on time. The turkey's aroma mixed with the faint smell of coffee and Lysol. I felt the chairs cool back against my palms and counted one breath. Everything was in place: the clause, the log number, the email, the witnesses. I would not need to raise my voice. The power of attorney would do it for me when the moment arrived. If this boundary feels right, keep listening. Chapter 2 reads the clause. By morning the cranberry dish was gone, but the line my mother spoke remained. I heard it in the hum of the coffee machine and the scrape of my father's walker against the hallway. Your help, not family. It echoed as I made him breakfast: eggs, soft toast, dry, the way he preferred since the surgery. He didn't repeat what had happened at the table. He rarely commented on family drama unless asked directly, and I didn't press. But when I handed him his morning medication, he looked at me and said, "You shouldn't let her speak to you that way." His voice was slow but firm. I nodded. He didn't know that the reply had already been written in ink, in margins, in signature lines. The reply just hadn't been read aloud yet. By 9 a.m., I had pulled up the POA PDF on my phone. Not just the front page, everyone sees that. I zoomed in on the second page where the alternate agent clause sat in quiet alignment under my name. The notary number was visible. The effective conditions were typed cleanly in bold. This POA remains in effect unless the primary agent is unable or unwilling to act within scope. It was the only line I needed. The rest would follow. At 9:42 an email pinged in. It was from Dr. Mendez's office, the cardiologist. Subject line: agent verification. I opened it with careful breath. Please confirm the authorized contact for Mr. Delgado's January 8 follow-up, it said. We require direct coordination with the documented agent for changes to care. I read it twice. This wasn't confrontation, it was a door. I replied and attached the scanned POA. That was my voice now. Factbox POA. A power of attorney allows a person to make decisions on someone else's behalf. Alternate agents take over. If the primary misuses or declines responsibility. By noon my mother was gone to run errands. I had the house quiet to prepare. I printed the POA, the email, and a copy of Dad's upcoming appointment confirmation. I laid them on the dining table, each page aligned. The sunlight from the kitchen window touched the notary stamp like it meant to underline it. The envelope from last night stayed beside me, creased now but dignified. At 2:17 p.m. my aunt called. "Hey sweetie, just checking on you," she said. Her voice was warm but cautious. "You seemed quiet last night." I was holding back, I told her. But not much longer. She exhaled into the phone. "You're going to show the paper?" I didn't answer directly. "Dad's doctor just emailed me. They need confirmation from the agent." Her pause told me she understood. "Let me know if I need to back you up." I saw her face when you stayed seated. That meant more than I let on. The air felt dense after the call, like something in the room had finally moved. I poured a glass of water and sat beside my father, who was reading the paper. I told him about the email, the printed proof, and what I was planning to say. He didn't speak for a long time. Then he folded his paper and looked at me. "Do it calm," he said. "She'll raise her voice." "You don't need to." I nodded. "That evening my cousin texted, 'She's telling people you overstepped. That it's disrespect.'" I let the text sit for a while before replying. The POA disagrees. Page 2, third clause. No reply came. But I knew it was read. At 6:30 I got the final signal. Another email, this time from the office assistant at the clinic. Confirmed Monday's appointment at 1015 will proceed under the alternate agent on file. My name was written out in full. Beneath it the line read, "Validated against received documentation." It was a soft confirmation. A quiet justice. I stood in the doorway of the living room and looked at my father. "It's done," I said. He looked up. "Paper sent," I nodded. "Then rest. Tomorrow we walk in with no yelling. Just dates." He had taught me that never raise your voice when you can raise a document. I gathered the papers once more. Each had a time, a name, a line of authority. That would speak tomorrow. and maybe for the first time the room would actually listen. I lingered in the quiet house, not rushing anything. The rhythm of the dishwasher filled the background like a second clock, each cycle humming with purpose. I ran my fingers across the counter edge, cool and smooth from decades of wiped-down mornings. My mind ran through every moment from the night before, each command, each glance, and how no one stopped it. The papers on the table didn't just represent power, they represented planning. My mother had assumed silence meant weakness. But I had read every word, asked every question, and waited. I didn't interrupt her last night because I didn't have to. The clause would interrupt for me. At 3:10 p.m. I reread the email from Dr. Mendez's office out loud. My voice was steady though no one was in the room. We required direct coordination with the documented agent. Each word felt like a flag planted gently in soil that had been tilled by months of caregiving, not dramatic, just certain. I added sticky tabs to the important sections: the notary number, the alternate agent clause, the physician's confirmation. This wasn't revenge. It was record-keeping. And record-keeping always wins when tempers fail. Before dinner I sat with my father again. The late sun touched the back of the couch. The smell of reheated stew and toasted bread filled the room. I showed him the paper. Not to persuade, just to inform. He looked, nodded, and said, "Your mother will hate this." I didn't flinch. "She'll say it's betrayal." I replied, "It's protection." That ended the moment. I knew what came next would be hard. But I also knew I wouldn't raise my voice. I had something better: a notarized clause, an email thread, and a confirmed appointment in my name. All dated, all filed, all ready. I pressed the edges of the documents into a single folder and whispered to no one. Let the paper speak before I ever do. The morning of the reveal arrived without fanfare. Just coffee, folded linens, and a quiet house. My father dressed himself slowly, button by button, steady despite the stiffness in his back. I packed the folder into my bag with care, no creases, no curled edges. Each sheet inside had already been witnessed by time. We were expected at 9:45. The elder law attorney's office sat 2 blocks from the pharmacy in a converted craftsman house. The sign on the door read, "McCall and Baines Advocates for Seniors." The porch creaked as we stepped on it. I glanced at my father. He gave me a half nod and didn't let go of the railing until we reached the door. Inside, the air smelled faintly of old paper and lemon cleaner. The receptionist gave us a smile, then gestured toward the conference room. It was small, just a table, 6 chairs, and a carafe of water with lemon slices. The notary sat in the corner, already reviewing her ledger. My mother was late. At 9:53 she arrived. No greeting, just a loud purse drop and a glance at my folder. "I wasn't told there'd be a meeting," she said. The attorney, Mr. Baines, replied without looking up. "It's not a confrontation. It's a clarification." He slid a printed agenda across the table. One line caught her eye: authority review POA documentation. She scoffed. "It's already been signed." Mr. Baines nodded. "Yes, and the scope is very specific." He turned to me. "Do you have your copy?" I opened the folder and laid out the 3 items: the POA, the cardiologist's request email, and the clinic's confirmation with my name. I didn't say a word. 1. Conference room, lemon water, untouched walls, a soft gray-blue. 2. I placed the documents on the table in a triangle. 3. If they deny this, the timestamps will carry the rest. 4. My hands were still, my voice unused. 5. Please read the line with alternate agent, second page. Mr. Baines adjusted his glasses. "We'll begin with the POA." He read aloud the relevant section. "In the event the named agent is unwilling, unable, or acts outside the documented scope, the authority shall pass to the alternate agent listed below." Then he turned the page. "That alternate is Miss Delgado. Effective upon overreach." He paused, then added, "which we believe applies." My mother's jaw tightened. "That's not what we agreed to." The notary looked up from her ledger. "This copy matches the one filed. Same stamp, same date." Her voice was neutral but final. My father shifted his cane against the table leg. The sound seemed to punctuate the silence. I said nothing. Mr. Baines continued. "Furthermore, we have an email from Dr. Mendez's office requesting verification of the agent for medical coordination." He held it up. "Miss Delgado responded and attached this exact POA." The clinic has since confirmed her as the agent of record. He placed the email next to the document. Everything aligns. My mother tried to pivot. This wasn't how Dad and I discussed it. My father spoke for the first time. We're discussing it now. His voice wasn't angry, just anchored. It stopped her more effectively than any rebuke. The notary closed her ledger. I've logged today's clarification. Mr. Baines nodded. This record stands. No override unless revoked in writing with medical cause. He looked at me. Miss Delgado, you are now sole agent for coordination of care and medical decisions effective immediately. I inhaled once and nodded. My mother stood up as if to leave, then sat back down. So what now? You just take over everything? I looked at her, not with triumph but with limits. I handle Dad's care appointments. That's all. The documents don't speak about feelings. They speak about logistics. Her mouth opened then closed. Mr. Baines finished. This meeting is for clarity, not conflict. The matter is resolved. No one clapped. No one cried. The lemon water remained untouched. We left the room slowly. My father held the railing again on the porch. I followed behind, my bag tucked close, the papers inside folded in their proper places. Outside, the sun warmed the pavement. I looked over my shoulder once before opening the car door. My mother stayed behind. She did not follow us out. On the drive home, my father cleared his throat. I didn't expect her to give it up so fast. I kept my eyes on the road. She didn't. She just didn't win. He looked out the window and said nothing more. Back at home, I placed the folder in the lockbox by the stairs. Not hidden, just housed. My father walked into the kitchen and made coffee. For the first time in weeks, he didn't ask what time his next appointment was. He knew I'd scheduled it. By early afternoon, the phone buzzed. It was my cousin. Her message read, "Heard what happened. Want to talk?" I typed a reply then deleted it. I'd talk later. Right now I just needed silence to settle. Later that evening, my aunt arrived with stew and a loaf of bread. "Not here to stir things," she said at the door. "Just wanted you to know I heard her tell someone you forged the papers." I raised an eyebrow. "I didn't." My aunt smiled. "I know. I was there when you mailed them." She placed the food on the counter and squeezed my arm. "Justice doesn't always shout. Sometimes it shows up as soup." I laughed quietly. The house smelled like garlic and pepper now. The kind of smells that make a home feel intact even when a family doesn't. Around 7:00 p.m., I reviewed the Monday appointment one more time. The nurse had confirmed my name on record, calendar updated, authorization verified. The last line read, "Agent will meet Dr. Mendez directly." At 7:20, I got a message from the clinic's intake assistant. "Just a note, your mother called earlier asking to reschedule. We informed her that only the documented agent may do so." She hung up. I read the line twice, then closed my phone. The lemon water at the meeting. The folded cane. The silence of not needing to argue. All of it came back in a single breath. Not every victory feels loud. Some are as quiet as a nod across a table. Some are printed in 12-point font and notarized. Some are just finally being listened to. After dinner, I sat at the kitchen table alone, a cup of lukewarm coffee in hand. The chair creaked beneath me, a sound I hadn't noticed in months. With no one watching, I let my shoulders fall. The tension had carried me through the day like scaffolding. Now it collapsed quietly. I pulled out the folder one last time. Not to review, but to remind myself this had been real. The paper edges curled slightly where I'd gripped them earlier. The ink on the notary stamp had bled just a little from age. I traced the words without reading them, familiar like a path walked over and over in silence. The overhead light buzzed faintly. Outside, the street lamp flickered into its evening rhythm. I could hear the low hum of the refrigerator, the occasional tap of a branch against the window. No shouting. No commands, just my breath and the faint comfort of order. In the distance, a neighbor's dog barked once and went quiet. Even that felt like punctuation. Tomorrow would bring more questions. More tests, more papers, more conversations to navigate. But tonight the line had been drawn. Not in anger, not in threat. Just in policy. In writing. That's how you restore dignity, one clause at a time. The next morning brought no fanfare, no confrontation. But it brought something colder: distance. My mother didn't come by, didn't call, didn't ask about appointments. The silence didn't feel like peace. It felt like plotting. I stayed busy. Laundry, medication logs, voicemail replies. Each small task formed a kind of armor keeping the deeper tension at bay. My father seemed lighter though. He hummed a little as he read the paper-folded towels neatly when he passed through the hallway. He didn't say it aloud, but something in his movements told me he felt protected now. Documented. At noon my cousin dropped by with 2 sandwiches and a careful tone. "She's saying you blindsided her," she said, handing me the food. "Claims it was supposed to be a private family matter." I took the sandwich, unwrapped it, and sat at the table. "I followed the document," I said. She ignored the scope. My cousin nodded slowly. I told her the papers were clear. She said clarity doesn't equal kindness. I didn't argue. "Maybe not," I said. "But clarity keeps appointments. Kindness can't override a clause." My cousin paused. "Do you want me to say something to her?" I shook my head. "Not yet. Let her sit with the silence. It's more educational than yelling." The porch rain started around 2. Soft at first, then steadier. I stood by the window and watched it trace the glass. The house felt calm but not settled. Like a courtroom after the judge leaves. At 3:05 p.m., my phone buzzed. It was my aunt again. "She's talking to family out of state," she said. "Implying you forged something or misread it." I stayed quiet for a moment. "I'll handle it," I said. With 1 sentence and 1 signature, I pulled the folder from the lockbox. The documents were still crisp, still aligned. I snapped a picture of the POA's clause about the alternate agent and added a screenshot of the clinic email. No commentary. Just the facts. I texted it to my aunt. "If anyone asks, you can show this." Nothing else needed. That night my father sat beside me on the couch and reached for the remote. Then he paused. "You okay?" he asked. I nodded. "Quiet days still take effort," I said. He smiled a little. "They take more actually." I didn't sleep much. My thoughts ran loops. What if she challenged the documents? What if she made a scene at the next appointment? What if quiet justice wasn't enough? At 1:12 a.m. a message came in. Unexpected. It was from my older cousin, the one who always took my mother's side. "Just read the POA." I didn't know she wasn't the only one named. That was all it said. But that was enough. I stared at the message for a long time, then replied, "There's a notary log if you'd like to see it." A typing bubble appeared, then disappeared. No further reply. The next morning I went to the grocery store. I needed coffee, yes, but I also needed to move through a space that didn't know the backstory. The aisles were full of people debating prices, reaching for soup, forgetting coupons. I liked the normalcy. At the checkout line I saw someone familiar. Mrs. Langston, our neighbor. She raised an eyebrow and said, "Heard there was a family shuffle." I didn't blink. "We followed the documentation." She nodded. "That's more than most." Then after a pause, "Your mother tried to recruit me as a witness last year." I declined. I stepped out into a burst of sunlight, grocery bag warm from coffee tins and apples. I had expected more pushback, more drama. But sometimes the biggest shift happens in whispers. In people quietly deciding not to take someone's side. Back home I typed a line into a document: "All future care decisions shall be supported by written notice co-signed by the agent." It wasn't legally binding, just something to read at the next family meeting. A boundary spoken aloud. That night I lit a candle at the dinner table. My father asked why. "We're naming new terms," I said. He raised his glass. "To quiet rules and signed pages." I clinked mine gently against his. Outside, the porch rain had stopped. But something cleaner had taken its place. Later that evening I opened the back window for air. The screen let in the scent of wet grass and distant charcoal, someone grilling, probably unaware that across the fence a quiet legal realignment was unfolding. I stood there, a while, cup in hand, and wondered when silence became the sharpest sound in a family. I thought about the next appointment. The clinic's waiting room, the name they'd call out, the forms they'd hand me to sign. Not her. Me. I imagined her showing up anyway, saying it was all a misunderstanding, that I was overreaching. I rehearsed saying nothing, just pointing to the folder. The phone buzzed again. This time it was from someone I hadn't spoken to in months, a cousin who had distanced herself from all the drama. Her message was brief: "Saw the docs. Proud of you." I didn't expect pride from anyone. but sometimes dignity echoes back. Before bed I printed out a fresh copy of the POA. Not because I needed another but because the act of pressing those words onto paper again made it feel more permanent. I placed it in a new envelope and labeled it with tomorrow's date. When I turned out the light I whispered to myself, let her test it if she must. The records will hold. And I believed it. Some truths don't need defending. Just filing. The envelope was smooth in my palm, heavier than its weight suggested. I had placed it inside my bag the night before, but pulling it out now, Monday morning, felt like calling a witness. We arrived 10 minutes early. The clinic smelled like coffee and copy paper. At the counter the receptionist smiled and said, "Mr. Delgado." I nodded, but it was me she looked at next. "And you're his daughter?" I handed over the folder. "Documented agent," I said. She took it without pause. In the waiting room my father sat quietly beside me, flipping through a magazine without turning a page. Across from us sat a woman humming to herself. The air vent buzzed low above our heads, a steady white noise that made time blur. I kept the folder on my lap unopened. I didn't need to wave it around. It had already done its work. Still, I felt better having it close. Proof is a kind of posture. At 1016 the nurse stepped into the room. "Mr. Delgado," she looked toward me next. "And you're his agent today?" I nodded. "Yes." No one corrected her. Factbox: documented agent. The legal representative authorized to make medical or financial decisions for another person, usually designated in a power of attorney. Inside the exam room the lights were bright and clean. I answered the nurse's questions clearly. Meds, sleep, eating. I knew them all. When Dr. Mendez entered he shook my father's hand, then mine. "We got your documents," he said. "Everything's in order." That was all. No challenge. No confusion. Just order. The appointment lasted 30 minutes. My mother didn't show. At 1047 I stepped back into the hallway, the folder still in my bag. We passed the front desk. The receptionist gave a quick nod, not the smile of retail courtesy but the look of someone who had seen the paperwork herself and remembered. On the way home my father said, "That was smooth." I replied, "It should be." We didn't talk more. The radio stayed off. But the silence wasn't heavy, it was intact. Back home I opened the folder and began a new section labeled Coordination. I added a short note. Jan 8, Dr. Mendez agent acknowledged in person. Agent. No presence or inquiry from previous agent. Outcome all normal. Documentation of the absence mattered as much as the presence. That afternoon my aunt called again. "She's asking questions about how you got the appointment changed," she said. "She thinks you jumped the line." I took a breath. "Tell her the clinic confirmed me before the call came in." Another pause. "Would you be willing to read that email to her?" I considered. "I'll show it. Not read it aloud." At 4:15 p.m., my cousin arrived. She had printed something. "She's starting to say your documents are fakes," she said. This is her version. It was a single sheet, an old draft POA from 4 years ago, unsigned with my name omitted. "She's been showing this to people," my cousin added. "But it has no notary. No date." I placed it next to my own. Side by side, it wasn't even a contest. One looked like a form from a website. The other had a notary seal signature and time-stamped clause. I took a photo of both and labeled the file "Disputed versus Executed." At dinner my father said, "I want you to call the office again next month just in case I forget." I nodded. "I already put it on the calendar." He smiled and pushed his plate forward. "You still do the sauce better than her." I almost laughed. Almost. After clearing the table, I returned to the folder and added new entries. 4:30 p.m. Jan 8. Received unsigned draft from cousin, compared to notarized copy, photo file created, title Disputed versus Executed. Factbox notarized. A document that has been formally witnessed and sealed by a certified official confirming the identity of the signer. At 6:12 my phone lit up with a message from the clinic. "Your mother attempted to confirm a February date. We advised her that only the agent may do so. No action taken." I added the entry. 6:12 p.m. Jan 8 clinic confirms denied request by previous agent. The folder was becoming a logbook now. Later that night I reread the original clause. If the primary agent is unable, unwilling, or exceeds scope, the line felt like a gate that had finally closed. Not in anger but in completion, I emailed myself the folder index. Then I printed a copy and slid it into the last pocket. The paper no longer needed to speak loudly. It was now a quiet shadow in the room, present referenced intact. Tomorrow I'd rest. But tonight I documented everything. Justice, it turns out, prefers bullet points. After dinner, I sat with the folder again. This time I wasn't updating. I was rereading. I opened to the page with the clause, the one that changed everything, and stared at it under the kitchen light. My phone buzzed with another message, this one from a family friend. Just checking in. Your mom's been quiet. All okay? I didn't reply right away. I scrolled instead, checking timestamps, reviewing the clinic's message from earlier. Then I typed, she's been quiet. The documents haven't. I closed the phone and traced the edge of the notary stamp. That ink had held the line when my voice couldn't. Not a shout. Not a plea. Just a recorded fact. The next morning I woke up to silence. Not just in the house but in the family thread. No one arguing. No gossip. No new accusations. I checked twice to be sure. Nothing. I poured coffee and stood near the window. The porch was wet again, soft from overnight drizzle. A squirrel darted across the railing. The air smelled like damp leaves and clean cement. I took one long sip and thought, this is what steadiness sounds like. Around 9:15 I opened a fresh document. Not a log this time. A boundary draft. Something I could read out loud if needed. I am the recorded agent. If the coordination will be by email in writing. No yelling. No cornering. No surprises. If these terms are broken, I leave the room. I titled it, Terms of Engagement. Before I went to bed, I ran my fingers along the envelope one more time. Smooth. Intentional. I didn't feel angry anymore. Just firm. Somewhere in that folder the quiet part of me had been recorded. Notarized doesn't mean louder. It means remembered. My mother arrived unannounced the next day. Not at the door but through text. Dad's prescriptions aren't correct. Who adjusted them? I stared at the screen, then flipped open the folder. Everything was already logged. The updated dosages had come from the doctor, not from me. I took a breath and typed, Dr. Mendez adjusted meds on Jan 8. See chart in folder. She replied instantly. I should have been told. I didn't answer. Not because I didn't have a reply but because the paper already had one. At 11:04 a.m. she showed up in person. She knocked once and let herself in with the old spare key. My father and I were at the kitchen table reviewing the medication tracker. She paused, took in the scene, and said, I just want to make sure he's not being mismanaged. My father looked up. We already met with the doctor. Everything's handled. She didn't sit down. I wasn't informed. You weren't the agent, I said quietly. The room stayed silent for a full 5 seconds. Then she moved closer. You know, this isn't about documents. It's about care. I nodded. Which is why the documents exist. To define care. To document it. My father tapped the edge of his pill organizer. The dosage is lower because of the blood work. That's what the doctor said. She narrowed her eyes. You're letting her run everything. I'm letting her follow instructions, he said. The air in the kitchen shifted. The microwave clicked. Somewhere outside a delivery truck rumbled past. She looked at me. You're making this legal. No, I said. It already was. She left 10 minutes later without touching her coffee. 1. Kitchen countertop cleared, pill box open beside the folder. 2. I laid the prescription printout on the table. 3. If she shouted, I'd point. If she blamed, I'd quote. 4. My hand stayed flat, my eyes level. 5. This line matches the dose, Dr. Mendez confirmed. At 1:32 p.m., I got a message from my cousin. She's furious. I replied, she's informed. That evening I updated the log. Jan 9/1104 a.m. Unannounced entry. Spoke re-prescriptions. Left after confirmation. Witness present Mr. Delgado. Tone elevated, no threats made. Outcome departure without engagement. I was starting to sound like a paralegal. But that was fine. Precision had replaced apology. At 2:45 p.m. my aunt came by. She carried a pie. Not here to fix anything, she said. Just here so you're not alone. We sat in the living room. My father napped down the hall. The air smelled faintly of cinnamon and old newspapers. She's asking around again, my aunt said. Trying to find someone who'll say she still has authority. She doesn't, I replied. I know. But she's in denial. You weren't supposed to win this. I didn't win, I said. I complied. My aunt smiled a little. Well, you complied with a backbone. We both laughed softly. I showed her the folder. I let her read the latest entries. She took her time, then handed it back. She's going to escalate again, she said. You know that, right? I nodded. But the paper won't change. At 5:10 p.m. I received another text from the notary neighbor. She had heard rumblings. If anyone needs a fresh witness, I'm still certified, she wrote. Let me know if backup helps. I didn't reply. But I saved the message. By 6:00, the light had turned gold through the blinds. I was tired but steady. Then came the call. The clinic. Hi, this is Jen at Dr. Mendez's office. Your mother called us again. She requested full records access and tried to modify the February schedule. I sat down. Did you authorize anything? No, she said. We reminded her that only the documented agent may coordinate care. I thanked her and wrote it down. Jan 9:553 p.m. Clinic call. Unauthorized access attempt declined. Caller previous agent. Staff reminder issued. No data accessed. No appointments changed. I printed that line and stapled it to the log. Evidence breathes better on paper. That night I ate pie and watched my father sleep in his chair. He looked more rested than usual. I thought about how many times I had bitten my tongue in that kitchen. How often I had washed dishes in silence while others made the rules. Now it was just paper. And posture. I added a new section. Boundaries and escalations. Future unannounced entries require written request. Document-only discussions in shared presence. All terms verbalized in next family check-in. Factbox escalation log. A chronological record of attempts to override or challenge documented authority maintained for clarity and response. AFAC. At 9:10 p.m. I drafted a group message for the cousins. Nothing confrontational. Just, POA documents are on file. For any care concerns, I'm available by text. Medical updates go through Dr. Mendez. Please respect written coordination. No exceptions. Only 2 people replied, both simply. Understood. The rest saw it. I could tell. Before bed I placed the folder on the dresser instead of back in the lockbox. I wanted to see it in the morning. Like armor. Like fact. Then I added one last line to the back page. The paper speaks. I don't have to. Tomorrow I'd let it speak again. The next morning I woke early. I didn't reach for my phone. I reached for the folder. I opened it not to add but to remind myself that each entry wasn't just reaction, it was restraint. At 7:22 a.m. I received a voicemail from a number I didn't recognize. It was short. This is Diane from the Senior Mediation Board. We received an informal inquiry regarding family dispute over care rights. Please return our call. I sat with that message for a long time. Then I logged it. Jan 10722 a.m. VM from Senior Board. Possible inquiry filed. No prior notice. Caller neutral. Response pending. I didn't feel panicked. I felt predicted. At 9:00 a.m., I called the board back. Diane answered. This is about a potential concern raised regarding a conflict in caregiving responsibility, she said. I replied calmly. There is a notarized POA on file in active execution. The previous agent has attempted overrides. Diane paused. Do you have documentation? Yes, I said. Would you like a PDF with timeline entries and screenshots? That would be helpful. I emailed the file within 5 minutes. At 9:45, Diane replied, received. No further action unless new evidence presented. File marked resolved. I added it to the log. When I told my father, he simply said, Did you save her number? I nodded. Good, he said. Keep the bridge even if they don't cross it. That afternoon I received a card in the mailbox. No return address. Inside a handwritten note. I remember how she spoke to you. You didn't imagine it. You handled it better than I would have. No signature. But the handwriting was familiar, an older cousin perhaps. The quiet ones watched the longest. I tucked it into the folder's inner sleeve. Then I went to make tea. Even paper needs warmth. Before sleep I placed the folder on my nightstand instead of the lockbox. Just for the night. I wanted its edges near my reach. Not because I expected a fight, but because some victories deserve to rest beside you. It didn't whisper. It didn't glow. It just sat there. Still. Ready. For 2 days there was silence. No texts, no visits, no surprises. Even the cousins stayed quiet. The family thread, which used to buzz with forwarded articles, prayer hands, and vague birthday reminders, went still. I knew it wouldn't last. It broke on a Friday. My mother sent a group message to 7 relatives. Family meeting this Sunday. Important clarity about Dad's care. Noon. My house. The tone was polite. The motive was not. She hadn't consulted me. She hadn't asked my father. She hadn't mentioned the POA. I didn't reply at first. Then my cousin messaged me privately. "Are you going?" I wrote back yes. With the folder. She didn't answer, but a minute later I saw 3 typing bubbles vanish from the group thread. That night I sat with my father in the living room. "She called a meeting," I said. "Sunday." He didn't flinch. "I won't argue." "I won't either," I said. "But I'll read the clause if asked." He nodded once. "Read it slow." The next day I prepared the papers again. Same folder. Same tabs. I printed 1 extra copy of the POA and slipped it in the back. At 6:02 p.m., the notary neighbor texted, "Need me present." I replied, "Only if it turns legal." She sent a thumbs up and said, "Bring your dates. They never lie." Sunday came. I wore neutral colors. I packed a thermos of tea. I placed the folder in a cloth bag, no branding, no loud zippers. The house smelled like reheated casserole and candle wax. My mother had set the table like it was Thanksgiving. 7 chairs. 1 stack of printed pages in front of her. Theatrics. My father entered last. He nodded to the room and sat beside me. My mother began quickly. "I've invited you all here because there's been confusion. I want to clarify what's best for our family and for your father's care." She gestured toward the pages. "This is a general release form I drafted. It names me as coordinator for any and all future decisions. If we can agree as a family, I'll file it with the clinic Monday." No one moved. I spoke first. Calm, measured. "That document is not enforceable unless accompanied by a revoked POA." She turned toward me, eyebrows arched. "So you're refusing to consider what the family wants?" I opened the folder. "I'm upholding what the law recognizes." I slid the notarized POA across the table. I placed the clinic's January confirmation beside it. Then I read the clause. "In the event the named agent acts outside the designated scope or becomes unwilling to comply with documented conditions, authority passes to the listed alternate agent." I looked up. "That's me." My mother opened her mouth. But this time someone else spoke. My cousin. She leaned forward. "I didn't believe her at first," she said, pointing at me. "But I've read the papers. I've seen the dates. She's not improvising. She's maintaining." The room shifted. Another cousin nodded. "The clinic called me too, you know. Said only the named agent had access." "That's her." My mother's face tightened. "So you're all taking her side now?" "No," my father said. "We're taking the side that already filed." 1. Dining room, artificial flowers in a bowl, silence stretching across plates. 2. I tapped the POA once, flat finger to paper. 3. Let the page carry what my voice refused to push. 4. My chest didn't rise. My breath was measured. 5. The notary seal outlasts opinion. My mother stood. "Fine," she said. "Then I'm leaving it to you." She walked to the kitchen. Her steps were quick, but her posture said delay, not surrender. My aunt spoke next. "That doesn't mean the conversation ends. It means the format changes." I closed the folder. The terms were always written. I just read them out loud. As the meeting ended, no one raised their voice. No chairs scraped. One cousin collected dishes. Another wiped the table. I took my time packing the folder. I left no paper behind. Outside, the afternoon sun hit the porch like summer hadn't ended. I stood there a moment longer than I needed to. At home I logged the event. Jan 14 family meeting. Attempted override via non-binding release form. POA read aloud. Confirmed by 2 relatives. No challenge filed. Authority reaffirmed. Then I wrote 1 line more. Reverse witness cousin previously aligned with challenger affirmed documented authority. I added her name gently with care. Not for revenge. Just for the record. That night I washed dishes slowly. Not because there were many but because I needed the sound. The running water, the soft scrape of sponge against ceramic, routine things that didn't require defense or proof. My father sat in his chair flipping channels without landing on one. You held the room, he said. I turned off the faucet and dried my hands. I let the paper hold it. He nodded. You know, your mother never liked silence. Always tried to fill it before it grew teeth. I smiled at that. Sometimes it's the silence that holds the shape of truth. I made tea and poured him a cup. We didn't toast. We just drank. Later I opened the folder again, not to add anything but to reread that one moment. We're taking the side that already filed. It echoed softer in my head than in the room, but it still felt real. Before I went to bed I placed a small note inside the log pocket. Sometimes confirmation sounds like a quiet chair not pushed back. And below that, I didn't win. The page just didn't lose. It was the first night in a while I slept with no folder within arm's reach. And still I didn't worry. In silence and ink I had finally been allowed to hold the center. The shift wasn't instant. It was subtle, like the way a house settles, quiet, structural, irreversible. By Monday no one disputed appointments. My mother didn't call the clinic. The cousins didn't group message. And for the first time in weeks I checked the folder just to glance, not brace. Dr. Mendez's office confirmed the February appointment. We'll expect you both, the nurse wrote. The email ended with a smiley face. I logged it anyway. Feb 3 agent confirmed by clinic. No alternate contact made. The silence held for a week. I kept up the logs. But nothing shifted. No violations. No veiled threats. Until the mail arrived. It was a standard envelope, handwritten. Postmark from 2 towns over. Inside a photocopy of the old draft POA, again unsigned. But this time it had a sticky note that said, "You'll regret ignoring family consensus." No name. No return address. I didn't flinch. I filed it. Jan 23 anonymous mail W divided by unsigned draft plus threat note. Action copied, logged, sealed. No response issued. Then I wrote 1 more line. Fear doesn't overwrite notarized intent. That evening I told my father. He listened, then said, "You want to change the locks?" I nodded. Yes. He reached for his wallet and pulled out $60. Then do it today. I scheduled the locksmith for 4:00 p.m. 1. Keys on kitchen counter, 2 new sets in a plastic bag. 2. I held them like receipts for peace. 3. No need to explain who could enter. The locks would decide. 4. My name wasn't louder, it was secured. 5. Only the people with folders get a key. By the weekend the tension had moved underground. No more direct conflict. Just absence. Then came the HOA letter. A formal notice. We received a complaint that you are housing an unlicensed adult caregiver. I blinked. The line was so specific, so obviously weaponized. I wasn't a caregiver by profession. I was his daughter. Still, I responded. Jan 27 HOA claim filed. False classification of agent role. Response submitted, attached POA notarized clause, clinic letter. Status pending HOA review. I made a new section in the folder, community interference. That Sunday I got a knock on the door. It wasn't my mother. It was the HOA chair, Mrs. Langston. She brought her clipboard but not her usual scowl. "Some confusion on our end," she said. "Mind if I review the document?" I invited her in, served tea and opened the folder. She read silently. Then nodded. "This isn't caregiving for pay, this is legal coordination." She signed off the complaint on the spot. Jan 28 HOA cleared issue. Case closed on site. She added one more thing. If anyone files again, send them to me first. I underlined her name in the log. Later that night, my cousin texted, I think she's giving up. I replied, no. She's testing ceilings. Then I drafted a clause for the next page. Each attack fails not because I shout but because I file. By early February it was quiet again. Until the voicemail came. It was from the senior board. Same woman as before. We've received a second inquiry. But this time it's anonymous and includes an allegation of document fraud. I sat down. I didn't panic. I pulled out the binder and clicked through tabs. The clinic note. The notary statement. The scanned email. The dated photo of the signature. I prepared a reply packet and emailed it within 20 minutes. By 3:42 p.m., the board confirmed all documents consistent with prior file. No further concern. I logged it cleanly. Feb 2 anonymous fraud claim filed to board. Fine, response submitted. All prior records re-verified. Status resolved. Factbox reverse witness. A person previously aligned with the challenger who later confirms or supports the truth through first-hand observation or documented evidence. That night my father said, feels like she's running out of options. I nodded. But she's not out of eyes. He looked puzzled. What do you mean? She still has people watching. Testing reactions, measuring whether we fold. He paused, then don't fold. File. We laughed. It was a soft laugh. But it stayed. At 10:00 p.m., I opened the folder and added a ribbon to the top tab. Just one. Not fancy. Just visible. It wasn't for decoration. It was for signal. Anyone who opened it next would know this wasn't just a file. It was a record of every time I chose to prove instead of plead. The next morning I woke to an envelope on the porch not dropped by mail. Hand-delivered, no address, no stamp. Inside a card with 3 words handwritten in cursive. Let it go. No name. Just that. I held it for a long time before adding it to the folder. It didn't go in the escalation log. It went in the sleeve marked ambient. Not every threat was formal, some just whispered from shadows. That afternoon I walked to the community bulletin board outside the clubhouse. On impulse I pinned a short note. Medical coordination for Mr. Delgado is under legal documentation. Any care questions may be routed via clinic, no exceptions. I didn't sign it. But I used blue ink, the same shade as the POA stamp. The next day it was still there. Untouched. That evening I typed a new summary page for the folder. I titled it Dignity Timeline. Oct 4 POA executed and notarized, Jan 8 appointment confirmed. Agent acknowledged. Jan 9, Feb 2, multiple override attempts all resolved, Feb 3 community notice, posted, current no standing challenges. At the bottom I added a final line, agent intact, process respected, family aware. The next Sunday I walked with my father to the park. He moved slow but steady. We sat on the bench near the ducks. You feel safe now, he asked. I feel recorded, I said. And that's enough. He nodded. Good daughter. He didn't say thank you. He didn't need to. Later that night I received a message from someone unexpected, my niece still in college. She wrote. He nodded. Good daughter. I stared at it for a long time. Then I replied. She wrote. I printed it out and tucked it into the folder's back sleeve. Some words don't belong in digital. They belong in paper. They belong in places that can be opened years later. That night I wrote one final clause. Legacy isn't spoken, it's referenced. And with that I closed the folder. But not the record. The next morning I left the folder where it always sat, now on the dresser near the window. The sun came through just enough to light the edges of the cover. I poured coffee, didn't check my phone, and stood still in the kitchen. The mail slot stayed quiet. No knock. No new envelope. There was nothing left to file. No one left to convince. The house didn't feel like a battlefield anymore. It felt like a room restored. In the silence I heard the refrigerator hum and the neighbor's wind chimes. Sounds that meant I wasn't bracing anymore. Just living. I ran my finger along the folder's spine and whispered, "We're good." No one heard it. Except the paper. And that was more than enough. Because sometimes peace is printed. And sometimes it fits in a folder no thicker than truth itself. People say paperwork is cold. That it replaces trust with transactions. But in this house it did something else. It restored shape to chaos. When family ties fray, the spoken word often becomes a battlefield. Who said what, who meant what, who remembers differently. But the written word, the notarized word, doesn't argue. It doesn't raise its voice. It doesn't forget. The power of attorney didn't just give me permission. It gave me protection. For my father, yes, but also for myself. Because I wasn't just defending his care. I was defending my own dignity inside a family that sometimes confused control with love. The document didn't erase the tension. It didn't turn everyone kind. But it gave shape to what had once been emotional fog. And from that shape I learned to set terms. No yelling. No cornering. No backroom consensus. Just paper. Just light. Just witness. If you're caring for someone you love, especially when the family disagrees, there may come a moment when your heart says one thing and your role says another. In those moments it helps to have your role in writing. Not to fight with. To breathe under. Because when the storm hits, paper becomes shelter. That folder taught me more than any apology I never received. It taught me that peace is not the absence of conflict, it's the presence of clear terms. And sometimes, the most loving thing you can do is file something. So if you're navigating those quiet storms, if you're the one holding the documents, holding the line, know this. You are not being difficult. You are being precise. You are not closing the door. You are clarifying the terms under which it may open again. This story was about my mother's push and my father's trust. But mostly it was about what happens when we choose dignity over drama, and proof over pleading. I hope it reminded you that silence can be power. That calm can be strategy. And that love, when documented clearly, becomes not just feeling but form. Keep your folder ready. Keep your voice steady. And remember, the paper speaks so you don't have to. When I look back now, I don't just remember the tension, I remember the turning points. The quiet victories that didn't make noise but made space. The moment the receptionist nodded without asking a second time. The cousin who said, "I didn't believe you until I read it." The HOA chair who stayed for tea instead of scolding. None of that would have happened if I'd fought the way I wanted to. Emotionally. Loudly. Desperately. Instead, it happened because I kept a record. I followed the clause. I answered softly but with backup. That's what I hope stays with you. That dignity isn't always loud. That justice can be documented before it's debated. Maybe your situation looks different. Maybe you're not dealing with medical care but property. Or finances. Or old hurts that resurface when roles shift and years stack up. Still, start the file. Print what matters. Sign what needs protection. Ask the hard questions while people are still able to answer them. And don't wait for things to fall apart before you define what counts. Because a lot of people say, "We'll figure it out as a family." But not everyone means the same thing by family. That folder became my translator. I didn't have to scream, believe me. I just had to show the seal. It's not easy. It's not quick. And some days it feels lonely. But one day, if not today, someone younger will notice. A niece. A neighbor. A son watching from the hallway. And they'll learn what I learned, that love can be soft and still immovable. That protection doesn't always look like confrontation. Sometimes it looks like paperwork in a calm hand. So write it down. Date it. Store it where silence lives. Because clarity isn't cold. It's a kindness in advance. And if this story helped you breathe a little deeper, there are more. At EN True Tales you'll find voices like mine quietly holding the line, one paper at a time. Explore stories of family care, inheritance, and quiet justice. Yours might be next.